Thank you very much for joining us at the Art Platform Symposium today. And the symposium will be distributed in both Japanese as well as English. You are able to choose your language channel on the YouTube settings. If you have any questions, please use the chat function from the distribution of live streaming to pose your questions, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible if the time allows. And we are looking forward to hearing many questions. The program today is live streamed, but you'll also be able to watch this at a later date in archived format. However, we ask you to refrain from making any recordings or capturing the screen. So we will now start our symposium today, and this is titled the Art Platform Symposium.
We would now like to begin by introducing to you Osaka Eriko, who is the President of National Museum of Art, Director General of the National Arts Center, and who is currently serving as the President of the Independent Administrative Institution, National Museums of Art. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Osaka Eriko. I'm very grateful to all of you because this is a particularly busy time of the year, as it is the end of the fiscal year. It also happens to be the 11th of March. Exactly 11 years ago, we experienced the Great East Japan earthquake and the nuclear power disaster at Fukushima. And we should remember and never forget and make sure that we pass on our recollections of this unprecedented experience, while we also think of the great difficulty that the people who are directly impacted by the earthquake and also by the accident at Fukushima experienced for the past 11 years. At the same time, the pandemic and its global spread, also the growing awareness about the SDGs, make us more aware of the existence of others and the importance of coexistence and of cooperation. We thought that the COVID crisis was coming to an end. However, we experienced the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And so our thoughts were shattered. As we see that the future is very difficult to forecast, looking at both politics and also economics, same for society, the tremendous disintegration of our natural environment, and where we find it even more difficult to see into the future, we need to be aware of the importance of imagination of others, including non-human life. And we also believe that art has the power, amongst many, to be able to stimulate the imagination and also the ability to think on the part of human beings, to broaden our horizons and our vision, and also allow us to discover new perspectives that may not usually be considered to be an absolutely essential part of what sustains life. And as for our museum organization, we are looking at how to enhance and also to highlight the characteristics and the independence of the different institutions, while we also can strengthen our functions responding to the changing circumstances, to also to appeal the importance of art and the meaning of it, and also to promote it even further. We look forward to this symposium where we're going to be connecting to many people from abroad as well. We would now like to have the opening remarks, which are going to be given by Wanibuchi Yoko, who is Parliamentary Vice Minister of Education, Culture, Sports, Science and Technology. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Wanibuchi, I'm Parliamentary Vice Minister of Education. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for this symposium organized by the Art Platform Agency for Cultural Affairs. I'd like to begin by giving you a talk which we're looking at the positioning of art, also about the future policies, Also, about the Japanese museums, the new center, and also what we hope to see from the independent administrative institution, National Museum of Art. First of all, looking at how art is regarded and how it is positioned in Japan, recently, in Japanese society and also in the cultural policy of our government, the importance of art has been growing and continue to grow steadfastly. However, there was an extremely symbolic event during the discussions early this year. On the 19th of January, the Diet member, Kajiyama Hiroshi, asked a question relating to the promotion of art and also reforms of the national art museums. The Prime Minister, Mr. Kishida, responded in a very positive and proactive way, and Mr. Kajiyama was asking about the ability to use the National Art Center as a global launchpad for information and utilize it as a way to promote and also to contribute to the promotion of Japanese art, and also that it might be important to implement a fundamental reform of the independent administrative institution of the National Museum of Art. And the question also went on to ask about the Prime Minister's thoughts about Japanese culture and art promotion. Mr. Kishida's response was that our cultural assets and resources and works of art are an important fount of soft power, which helps to attract the admiration of the world, and also that we should continue to send out messages and continue to make people aware around the world of the attraction of our art resources, cultural resources, and artworks, and also to continue to have sustained and continuous support in order to have new creation. And he pledged that there would be promotion of art, culture and art, and that it was going to be an important function of the National Art Museum, independent administrative body, to serve as the core for the global messages and messaging. So it is a very encouraging point. However, I'd now like to look at how we have seen some of the evolution over the years. This looked at the situation in 2019, immediately before the pandemic. And we discovered that only a quarter, or 23.6% of the entire population or the respondents had actually had an opportunity to appreciate art. And looking at the generational difference, 35.3% of the over 70s had gone to museums or had an experience of art, but teenagers came down to 18%, in that people in the 30s were only 13%. So it was not something which was pursued by the younger generation. Looking at this, families with children basically did not go to museums. When it comes to preschoolers, there was only 5.6% of all families who had a preschooler who had gone to a museum or gone to see artwork. All the other categories were in the low tens, were about 12 to 14%. This shows that there's a disparity or distance between everyday life and the art appreciation opportunities. So I believe it is extremely important to introduce more opportunities for the people to come into contact with real art and to make it into something which is an extension of everyday life. And we should broaden the horizons and also the support basis of people who can appreciate art. Looking at the working group, we looked at the situation to create an ecosystem so that new artists will come forward and they would be able to sustain and continue their activities. So the artistic value, which is the essence of art, the market or economic value, and the social value, which would be the ability to heal, to provide consolation, to also to help people to foster their individual ability to make judgments or evaluations and their creativity. So a well-balanced development of all three factors and creating a virtuous circle was going to be extremely important. For an artist to continue to create, it's important to have an audience and also people who would buy the actual completed work, which means the people or citizens, including collectors, need to fulfill an important role. So this looks at the situation where we have a number of obstacles that need to be overcome. So how should the future develop?
Here is a summary of the report prepared by the working group, which I mentioned earlier. This emphasizes the importance of raising the level of artistic, academic, economic, and social values of art in a well-balanced manner. It is also recommended that there be a fourth pillar added to the program for creating an international platform. Acting on the report and the suggestions, there will be a cultural economy committee established this fiscal year, and with a working group for art promotion, which will study the necessary measures for advancing the three values in a balanced manner. One of the speakers today, Ms. Mami Kataoka of the Mori Art Museum, plays a central role in this working group for art promotion. Some of the discussions so far addresses the role of the new Art Communication Center, one of the main topics today, as well as how to create quality collections in Japan, how to further art criticism activities, how to enhance the quality of archives, and to bring about drastic changes to the appreciation education. There are various issues surrounding the creation of national collections or improving the quality of archives. Here, I would like to address three of these issues. Firstly, the importance of collecting contemporary work. Museums need to actively purchase works produced by contemporary artists. It is important for the museums because they are able to acquire high-quality works at a relatively low price. Once the artists are recognized internationally, Japanese museums will no longer be able to afford the works of these Japanese artists, and their works may have to be sold outside of Japan. The second issue involves taxes imposed on donations of artwork. Public museums usually find it difficult to spend much funds on the works of artists whose reputations have yet to be established, whereas collectors are free to spend their money and are more likely to be able to acquire quality works from contemporary artists. However, the intentions of these collectors are not necessarily shared by their family members. Once the collector dies, and if the bereaved family tries to donate such collections to museums, taxes may be levied for the increased value of the work after the purchase. Donations are difficult to make so that the collection is more likely to be sold outside of Japan. And finally, it is also important to maintain archives of materials involving artists. Such material are necessary to raise the value of the artist's works and to prove their worth. However, these archive materials are also being sold outside of Japan. I'd like to go back to the issue of art appreciation education. In Japan, research shows that grade school pupils tend to enjoy art, such as drawing or crafts, but as they become older, they tend to dislike art as a school subject. It is said that 87% of second graders say that they like art and crafts, but only 37% of high school students like art. One reason for that is that official guidelines for teaching in schools art appreciation is not regarded as an independent subject, and education on appreciation is not required for her teachers' licenses. while children enjoy arts and crafts in the lower grades, once they become older and find that they are not very good in drawing or in artistic expressions, they start to hate art. It is important to teach them how to enjoy or appreciate art so that they can become consumers of art when they grow up. I believe it will be important to see how appreciation can be positioned in the most appropriate manner in the school curriculum. Finally, I would like to touch upon the new Art Communication Center of the National Museum of Art, which is the theme of this symposium today. My wish is the new Art Communication Center and the independent administrative institutions, the National Museum of Art, become the hub for all the domestic museums and act as a main organ for promoting art in Japan in a comprehensive manner. As the hub for the Japanese museums, they will play the role of the contact point for accepting work of art, to organize information amongst the museums and make them available for access from within as well as from outside of Japan, and to create networks which will promote the dissemination of information globally. I hope that they will also be active in supporting not only the museums but also the artists, as well as promoting appreciation education. I have discussed the current status of the nation's art promotion policies and what is expected for the future. I am hoping that there will be active discussions today on the goals and the roles of the Art Communication Center. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Vice Minister. We now let's go on to session 1, where we're going to be looking at what the Art Communication Center's aims should be. You'd now like to call upon the Director of Mori Art Museum, Kataoka Mami, who is the chair of the Contemporary Art Committee Japan, and who's continued to be working on this project from fiscal year 2018. The name is still tentative, but we have a new organization called the Art Communication Center, and Director Kataoka is the executive advisor of that. Thank you. My name is Kataoka. I'd like to talk about the art platform and about the Art Communication Center. The art platform and the Art Communication Center. I'd like to walk back and tell you about the background which made it necessary to set up these organizations. This shows you what has been happening after the collapse of the Cold War regimes, and where there is multipluralism and also diversity regarding culture and everything. Looking at Japan, Europe, New York. In the past, prior to this era, the post-1990s, Japan or other areas were basically looking at the major centers of art, such as Europe and the United States. However, what changed after that was the multipolarity meant that all these different loci actually became centers for art creation. Just look at Asia, for example. I've just picked up some of the key contemporary and modern art museums. And on the left, there's a list of the Triennale and the Biennale. And the green indicates the number of the key art fairs. The red refers to the museums of contemporary and modern and contemporary art. The basic thing is that this has been really growing exponentially from the 1990s onwards. And there are a number of museums that were created before the 1990s, where I've put in the year when the museums were established. But as for the Biennale, Gwangju in South Korea, which was started in 1995, was the starting point. And since then, we've been seeing a growth of Biennale and Triennale in different locations. For example, in Hong Kong, last year, M+ opened, but Beijing, Shanghai, and other locations have been seeing a remarkable number of new museums open up. National Gallery Singapore has opened. We also have the art fairs. We also have the Singapore Biennale. And the basic thing is that the museum, the Biennale or Triennale, and the art fair, these three factors have created locations where art continues to grow and flourish. Now, looking at museums, the Japanese really had a head start. However, in the past 30 years, we've seen this really extremely rapid growth in other locations. So in fiscal year 2014, the Agency for Cultural Affairs, for the first time, clarified the key issues and the key points that they saw surrounding contemporary art. They announced this as a clarification of the points for discussion. So this is already 24 years after the 1990s. So we're pretty late, but we're getting there. But we started, and from fiscal year 2018 onwards, we have started the art platform. This is an attempt to try to heighten awareness and also the value which is placed in contemporary Japanese art. We also identified a number of key texts which were selected and which were translated and then shared with foreign audiences. We also focused on building networks. The idea was to continue this for 5 years. Next fiscal year is going to be the end of that 5-year period. And the Art Communication Center is where we're discussing, we could perhaps see an avenue for handing on or transferring the functions which have been fulfilled by the art platform. One of the objectives really was to create a sustainable system or an ecosystem. And so the art platform is really about creating that platform. So building up networks, sharing information, translation of texts, all of those activities have been pursued. And the fruits of that can be seen via Art Platform Japan. We hope that you'll have time to look at this. There's the address. And it's been updated this month as well. For example, there are currently 140,000 pieces of art which are held by Japanese museums and art museums, and the collections continue to grow. And up to now, it has been difficult to show visual images, but we have been able to change the situation. So we're going to be adding thumbnail images. Readings will make it possible to access new English translations of key selected texts. There will also be an ability to look at databases, looking at the most recent research findings. Programs will provide you with access to the archives of international networking programs. Now I'd like to talk about the National Art Communication Center. It isn't a final name yet, but we're calling it for the time being. In 1952, immediately after the post-war occupation by the general headquarters of the Allied occupation forces came to an end, the Tokyo Museum of Modern Art was established in 1952. And after that, the Matsukata collection, which had been seized by the French before the war, was handed back to the Japanese, and a new museum, which was created expressly for that collection in 1959. And that's the National Museum of Western Art. 1963, the Kyoto Museum of Modern Art was established. In 1977, the National Museum of Art Osaka was opened on the grounds which had hosted the 1970 Expo. It has now been relocated to Nakanoshima, which is in the heart of Osaka. And these were the forerunners which were put together under the umbrella of the administrative body, National Art Museum. And this museum, or rather National Art Center, was established in 2007. The National Film Archive, which was previously included as a part of the Tokyo Museum of Modern Art, which was separated and became independent in 2018. And the National Handicrafts Museum, which is still a part of the Tokyo Museum of Modern Art, has now relocated physically to Kanazawa, which is on the Sea of Japan side. And all of these are independent administrative bodies, but the idea is to create a means of linking together all these institutions. And we've dubbed it the Art Communication Center for the time being. So by adding function to this, we believe it might be possible to think about the national set collections, but also to expand the database so that we can look at the collections which are held by private museums and also which are run by non-national authorities. In other words, where we're thinking that perhaps the Art Communication Center can function as a hub. We're also thinking about how we could put this onto the international circuit, which will help to heighten awareness and also make people more aware of the quality and the caliber of art. And by promoting that, we hope to be able to enhance on that international standing. The third element would relate to learning, to conduct research and also studies and actual practice by contributing to the fields of education, medicine, and also social welfare, business, and tourism, with promotion of social linking up and interaction, and to enhance the social value. So, tapping the utilization of the work, of looking at the information and materials, learning, and also having this interlinking and social interweaving of different aspects of society. We think that perhaps the possibility exists for the art platform's function of sharing information abroad and internationally could be a part of this, but we do think it's important to have not just silos, but also the ability to cut across different sections and to connect different institutions, different elements of society together horizontally and in an organic way. So our thought is that perhaps we can act as a window for these activities, and we can provide an important integral part, or prove to be an important integral part, rather, of the promotion of art. We also would like to use the time available in this symposium to look at some of the case studies that exist abroad, and we have 3 guest speakers who are going to be sharing their experiences with us. And after that, we'd like to invite individuals who are involved with art in different ways in Japan to ask them for their thoughts and what they hope to see. And we would like to continue with these discussions and deliberations for the next fiscal year onwards as well. So we'd now like to go directly into session 2.
In this session 2, we will be looking at international case studies of art support. Today we have from the Tate Modern, Devika Singh, and from Austria affiliates, Mr. Jasper Sharp, and from the Singapore National Gallery, we have Horikawa Lisa, who is a curator and director there. So we will start in order of the names I've just introduced. I'd like to then show you about a 10-minute presentation that has been prepared by Devika Singh.
Good evening. My name is Devika Singh. I'm a curator of international art at Tate. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. As part of my responsibilities, I oversee the acquisition of South Asian art for the collection, and I'm also part of the Hyundai Tate Research Center Transnational, which seeks to bring new perspectives on art to the museum. Today, I want to share a little bit more about Tate's collection, its program, and its research, and how the three are intrinsically connected. Now, Tate, as you may know, has 4 sites, 2 in London, Tate Britain and Tate Modern, which you can see here, as well as Tate St. Ives and Tate Liverpool. But it only has 1 collection. Tate holds the national collection of British art from 1500 to the present, as well as international modern and contemporary art. It's from that perspective, a national collection that has always been or has become, it depends on how one conceives of Britain's imperial past, international. To give you a few numbers, the collection counts over 70,000 artworks from both British and international artists. And this is, of course, a growing collection. Each year, we add about 500 artworks to the collection with some variation depending on when large gifts are made. Most importantly, the collection is never static, not only because it keeps on growing, but because artworks are constantly being reinterpreted. Initially, what became the Tate Gallery focused on collecting British art, and it's only in 1917 that it began collecting what was then referred to as non-British art, then foreign art, and eventually international art. Now, I won't run you through the entire history of Tate, but let me give you a few images, show you a few images, and tell you a little bit more about Tate Modern's first major group exhibition, Century City. Tate Modern was opened in 2000 with the mandate of displaying modern and contemporary international art. And in 2001, this first major exhibition, Century City, opened. This exhibition, which I was fortunate to see at the time, left a lasting impression. It was indicative of a perspectival shift. In the exhibition, cities across the globe, from Moscow to Lagos, New York, and Paris, were chosen to represent a particular decade of the 20th century. Now, this multicentricism has since imposed itself, but this was something very new at the time that hadn't been done certainly on such a scale in a European museum, that is. Now, while only one city was chosen for each decade of the 20th century, the museum also took the bold step, which is quite important to me, of choosing both London and Bombay to represent the 1990s. And there was a very powerful section dedicated to Bombay, curated by Geeta Kapoor and Ashish Rajajaccia. You can see a few images here, as well as a London section, also in the Turbine Hall, curated by Emma Dexter. I know that you were particularly keen to hear about our collection, and there are different ways that an artwork can join the collection. In terms of the mechanisms in place, one of these is through an acquisition committee. At the moment, there are 8 such committees, one of these being the South Asian Acquisitions Committee, which allowed, for example, an artist such as Atul Doria, represented in the Century City exhibition, albeit within other artworks, to come into our collection. So these committees are regionally focused, except for the photography acquisition, and they in short bring together benefactors who support the acquisition of artworks for the museum. An important aspect that I should mention is that once accessioned, these artworks cannot be deaccessions. They're acquired, if you will, in perpetuity. So that what we call collection care, which concerns the conservation of the works, and that very much in all media, as well as considerations pertaining to storage, form an integral part of the thinking that goes behind an acquisition. But the point is that once artworks enter the collection, even through the channel of one of these regionally focused committees, they are always displayed transnationally. That is, in a way that connects artists from across geographies. Tate Modern, which is my focus tonight, has from that perspective no South Asian or Latin American wing or gallery, which doesn't mean that it doesn't pay attention to where artworks were made. And here it's important to remember that when Tate Modern opened in 2000, one of its specificities was really to display artworks thematically rather than chronologically. This was something that Tate curators were also thinking about at the same time as they were planning for Century City. So instead of trying to represent a linear advancement of the history of art, Tate's collection radically broke with such established models and opted instead for a thematic hang. And this enabled Tate Modern to juxtapose artworks both in a transnational, but also in a transhistorical way, very much in a manner similar to the way artists are themselves borrowing, pilfering, and dialogue with artworks from different geographies and different times. Now, an example that illustrates what I was just referring to is the pairing in the gallery of Meditation with Open Eyes by Atul Doria with Composition B by Piet Mondrian. And I'm now going to run you through a few specific examples of how artworks are displayed in the collection hang. Doria here in this artwork packs in many of his references from Robert Rauschenberg to Rabindranath Tagore, references from here and there, and also from high and low. And he was specifically inspired by the Mondrian work to the right. And we have the opportunity to display the artworks opposite each other. Sometimes more formal or conceptual associations drive the way the collection is hung. This was the case of the presentation of London-based, Karachi-born artist Rashid Al-Ra'in, which was activated close to a sculpture by the German Charlotte Bosenensky, or of the Paris-based Lebanese-born Tara Qatari, whose work you can see here in the background. And this is a colleague of mine who is interacting with the installation as part of a presentation in the Tanks titled Active Sculpture in 2016. Another way of displaying works is to focus on a given city at a moment in time, but to present the city in a transnational way. And we call such rooms a view from. A view from Tokyo, for example, focused on the 1970 Tokyo Biennial between Man and Matter. It used it as a starting point to explore exchanges between European and North American artists who were invited to participate in the biennial, and those, for instance, amongst others, of the Monoha group. So on the Japanese side, the Rome showcased artists such as Jiro Takamatsu and also his students, including Louis Buffon and Koshimizu Suzumu, just to give you some examples. The point in such rooms is to showcase how specific cities and the exhibitions they hosted created opportunities for international artists to come together. The point really here is one of connections. Other rooms, more loosely focused on a historical transformation, include The Disappearing Figure. Its subtitle is Art After Catastrophe, and the theme of this room is really the renegotiation, the very radical renegotiation happening after the Second World War. One of the fundamental questions that underpins such a room is how to continue making art after the Second World War. And here you can find an artwork by the Indian Jairam Patel, which was very much influenced by his stay in Japan in 1971. And this artwork was long displayed next to one by Tsuyomoshi Maekawa. Finally, one last example I wanted to give you is that of the International Surrealism Room located in the adjacent space, which has been a pivot of the circulation at Tate Modern. In this display, you'll find artists long associated with the group, but also others who pursued its legacy. For example, the Sri Lankan photographer Lionel Vent, and his work are hung next to that of René Magritte, but also Leonora Carrington and Helena Vera da Silva, just to give you some examples. And this is a room, I should add, that is constantly being permutated very much in the spirit of surrealism. In addition, I should mention that Tate Modern, at this present moment, is also hosting an exhibition titled Surrealism Beyond Borders, which very much challenges established narratives on the movement, typically centered on Paris and on André Breton's Cold Circle. Here, it's very much a wider, geographically plural net that is thrown in this exhibition that is very much. The Hyundai Tate Research Center Transnational, which I work closely with, supported the research that undergirds this exhibition. And one of the aims of the research center, as I quickly mentioned earlier, is to move away from conventional narratives of art and shift the perspectives away from Western Europe and North America. And while this has always been one of the missions of Tate Modern, societal debate as well as research are constantly changing and adapting, and so must our frameworks. To give you one example of the many things that the Research Center does, each year we organize an annual conference. And in 2020, we were very lucky to have the opportunity to collaborate with Mami Kataoka and the Mori Art Museum, as well as with Sophia University. Our conference, which I co-convened, was titled From Alexandria to Tokyo, Art, Colonialism, and Entangled Histories. And its aim was to address, through the perspective of art, non-European colonialism and experiences of domination. So while institutions in the UK must continue to engage with the legacies of British imperialism, collaborations such as these, which bring fresh comparative perspectives, are absolutely key. Building on this, something particularly important to the museum, including the Hyundai Tate Research Center, is to bring together curators with different fields, different regions, and different specializations. And we currently have 13 curators and senior curators, as well as adjunct curators who are based in different places across the world. The Hyundai Tate Research Center more specifically counts 3 adjunct curators, one for Caribbean diasporic art, one for Africa and the African diaspora, and one for First Nations and Indigenous art. And we have other curators based in China and Mexico and the United States. Ultimately, working transnationally, be it for a national institution, relates to what we do, to who we are, as well as, I should add, to who we speak to, and this within the specific context of London, in the case of Tate Modern, and of the United Kingdom, so that the diversity of our audiences in terms not only of who they are, but what their expectations are for the museum, visually and intellectually, is very much at the forefront of what we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to ask all 3 speakers a number of questions after all 3 presentations. Next, we're going to be hearing from Jasper Sharp, who's the director of Phileas, which is located in Vienna. In 2018, when I was artistic director of the Sydney Biennale, Phileas was a supporter, and I was also able to take the opportunity to take advantage of the research support, and I think they've got a very interesting model. Jasper, please.
Good evening. My name is Jasper Sharp. I am speaking to you from Vienna in Austria. I've been a museum curator for the last 20 years, working at the Peggy Guggenheim Collection in Venice and at the Kunsthistorisches Museum here in Vienna. Since 1 year, I've been dedicating my time exclusively to the organization Phileas, which is an organization that I founded back in 2014. What Phileas does, in a nutshell, what we seek to do is to strengthen the voice of Austrian and Austria-based artists on the international landscape. The reason we set up Phileas in the first place, really 2 reasons. One is that we had many, many conversations with artists who live and work here about what they felt they had, what they felt they were missing. And what we kept hearing from people was, we feel well represented here with the gallery system, we exhibit publicly, we have teaching opportunities, we can earn a living. What we miss is contact with the rest of the world. They didn't really feel that they had a voice beyond the borders of Austria. The other reason is that Austria, like several countries in Europe, has a very, very generous public funding system for the arts. But that system is almost entirely passive. They wait for people to make funding applications to them, and then they will, if the project is good, they will support the project, the government, but they will not, in many cases, actively go out to seek opportunities for artists and writers and filmmakers and so on. So we created Phileas with the idea to be extremely proactive, to reach out to the world, to help make exhibition opportunities possible for artists. Again, unlike many other things in Austria, we are almost entirely privately funded. We put together a group of wonderful private individuals, many of whom are philanthropists, collectors, most of whom are based in Austria, but others around the world who have some connection to Austria. And the agreement we reached with them is that they would fund our activities, and in return, we would welcome them into the production of those different projects and activities. So were we to produce an exhibition at a biennial in Gwangju, for example, they would help select the project with us for funding. They would come to the studio of the artist. They would visit several times to see the project in development. And then hopefully they would travel with us to the opening of the project. So they see the whole thing happen. How Phileas works, we begin really by reaching out to people, by contacting biennials, museums, arts institutions around the world. We let them know that we exist, that we're here. We'd be happy to collaborate with them. We invite curators for research trips to Austria, which we fund and organize. We try to do these in person where we can. Obviously, over the last couple of years, it's been necessary to do many of these virtually. We help plan these research trips. Often a curator will share an idea, a concept for an exhibition or a biennial that they're preparing. We will respond with suggestions of artists with portfolios. And then, as is often the case, curators will come, we'll accompany them to different studios and so on, in the hope that they find something that they like and that they would like to pursue for a participation in their exhibition. We will invariably then help fund the production of the work for that exhibition, often together with the Austrian government. We co-fund many of our projects together. Many of these collaborations turn into long-term collaborations. So we're coming up to our third collaboration with the Venice Biennale for the main exhibition. We're coming up to our fourth collaboration with the Biennale in Liverpool, with the Biennale in Lyon, with the Biennale in Sydney, which we did with Mami. And the two final pieces of this jigsaw are that we try to acquire as many of the works that we have produced and donate them to public institutions, to museums, mainly in Austria, but we're thinking in the next year or two to expand this out to international museums around the world. And we also, beginning early next year, we will also have an exhibition space in Vienna, which we will also exhibit many of the works in ourselves. In terms of our activities, we have a very active visitor program, which lasts all year round. We have curators coming individually to visit studios, foundations, galleries, museums, artist-run spaces. These trips last from 1 day to 1 week. And again, we fund, organize these, and give any assistance we can. Each year we run and organize a group research trip where we put together between 8 to 12 curators from different museums around the world and biennials and Kunsthalles, and we create a program that everybody joins. And it's fascinating for us to meet them, for them to meet each other, and for them to be introduced to the art world here. This is something that we do once a year. This year it's happening in June. And again, we fund this trip and organize it and so on. We're also beginning this year a program to invite art critics from around the world to come to Austria to see what's going on here. We hope that perhaps they end up writing something about this, but or broadcasting. It's not necessary, only if something grabs their interest. Again, this is something that we fund and organize for them. And in many cases, we hope that these critics will also speak publicly while they're in Vienna about their own work and their approach to writing. We are beginning a program to invite museum groups to Austria. So patron groups, boards of museums, made up mainly of collectors and philanthropists, but often led by the museum's curators and director. This is something that we have been doing informally over a number of years, but we would like to expand and do. We run a public event program here in Vienna, talks with different interesting people, which we open up to the public, either physically or we film them and disseminate the films. We've begun publishing recently in an effort to help some of the younger artists reach an international audience. We've started a series of books called The First Monographs, which the first one has just been printed last week. It's being bound at the moment. It'll be presented on the 30th of March, dedicated to the photographer Sophie Thun. And this will be the first overview publication of a younger artist, which we can then send out to people around the world. And very excitingly, it's a project which has been 2 years in the making. We will be opening an exhibition space here in Vienna, right in the center of town on the Ringstrasse, close to the Albertina Museum, close to the Kunsthistorisches. And this will be an exhibition space where we can bring back 3 or 4 of the different projects that we've done each year around the world and show them here in Vienna before they hopefully would be donated to an institution. It'll be our office, a public office, so people can come in and learn more about what we do. It'll be an event space also for talks and screenings and performances and so on. And it'll also be a type of research center where an international curator who's visiting Austria can come and meet us, sit down, look at portfolios, look at catalogs, and help. We can help also to arrange studio visits on the back of that research. We will system curators who work in museums and institutions in Austria to spend some time abroad, collaborating with a museum on a particular project, or also just working alongside someone, shadowing someone, being mentored by someone to help broaden their experience of the international art world. And we're also looking into an internship program here at institutions in Austria. So lots going on. We're 6 people working rather hard, and it's having a huge effect already. We've seen the different things that are happening around the world. We've been able to increase the presence of Austrian artists at international biennials by around 200% just in the first 5 or 6 years. So lots still to do, but it's an exciting time, and it's a great project to be involved in. And the appreciation from artists is enormous. So yeah, that's a little introduction to Phileas, and I look forward to continuing in the conversation in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope that Phileas could come right to Japan and continue their work. And now we have Eriko Lisa, who is from the National Gallery, Singapore, and she will be talking to us about her experience after having worked in Fukuoka. She has gone to Singapore, and she has remained there to work for the National Gallery, Singapore.
Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Horikawa Lisa, and I'm responsible for the curatorial and collections at National Gallery Singapore. National Gallery Singapore was established in November 2015 by transforming the 2 colonial period architectures of the former Supreme Court and former City Hall, located at the Central Civic District of Singapore. The original idea to establish this new museum was first announced by the Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong in 2005, and it took us 10 years for innovation and the construction work. In terms of our curatorial perspective and approach, we are home to the world's largest museum collection of Singapore and Southeast Asian modern and contemporary art, and which we continue to develop to reflect its full diversity and significance. And this last point has been especially significant as we deepen our awareness with the values of diversity and inclusion in recent years. In terms of our approach to art histories, of course, art histories rests at the center of our curatorial work. But we consider the art histories of Singapore and Southeast Asia not as something to be seen in silo, but very much integral to the global art histories. And our research and programming aim to promote the art of the region, not only within the region, but also internationally. With regards to our approaches in the writings and rewritings of art history, we take a very reflexive approach. So we approach art histories as something that is not static, but something that is continued to be rewritten, re-investigated, and re-interrogated. Just to provide some broader historical context to a discussion, most museums in Southeast Asia have their origins as colonial museums. There, museums historically operated as an apparatus to manifest the achievements of scientific and ethnological research by the colonial administration. the act of collecting, categorizing, and writing of histories were deeply intertwined with the colonial project. Hence, in the post-independence period, the museums of the newly independent states in the region sought to retrieve their agency by redefining and rearticulating their national histories. Many countries took quick measures after the independence to open museums displaying the nation's collection and the national narratives. Singapore also took a similar museological trajectory from a colonial to post-independent museums. The Raffles Museum and Library was established in 1874. It was renamed as the National Museum in 1960. And the natural science and history continued to dominate the scope of this museum for a while, until one of the museum's wings was converted to form the first state-level art museum in 1976 as the National Museum Art Gallery. NMAG was later succeeded and replaced by Singapore Art Museum, or SAM, in 1996. And so when National Gallery Singapore opened in 2015, the artworks in Singapore's national collections were reallocated between SAM and us, with the gallery inheriting the collection of works produced primarily between 19th to 20th century, and SAM continuing to be the custodian of the works of contemporary art. What differentiates our collection from those of other national museums in the region is our focus on Southeast Asia. The collection's regional orientation was in fact already visible and very much inscribed in the seed donation of more than 100 works made by Dato' Lopuanto in 1962. He was a philanthropist and a patron of art, active from the 50s, and collected quite extensively works from Southeast Asia. So his collection, with its regional orientation, very much formed the basis of what is today our collection. And already as you can see in the image that I'm showing here, the man of the smoking a cigarette, and also the portrait of the Balinese woman on the right. They're both works by Indonesian artists, so the scope really extended beyond Malaya. Today, our collection has developed to about approximately 8,000 works with 3 killer. Today, our collection has developed to about 8,000 works with 3 key pillar focus areas. One, of course, being Singapore, second, Southeast Asia. And we also have a substantial collection of ink works where traditionally Singapore has grown a very interesting trajectory of its own. The National Gallery's organizational structure is such that the gallery, along with 2 other institutions, SAM and Singapore Tyler Print Institute, constitute an entity called Visual Arts Cluster. And we're companies limited by guarantee, even though we're largely funded by the government. So the combination of the public sector practice and the private entity provides us with a certain level of flexibility in the museum operation. But what's interesting and what's perhaps quite unique to Singapore's context is that the collection of all the national level museums, including the gallery and including the SAM, are part of a larger entity called the National Collection, which is governed by the National Heritage Board, and both the VAC, the Visual Arts Cluster, and the MCC, the National Heritage Board, report to MCC, which is the ministry. And under National Heritage Board, also a group of heritage museums that are governed directly by them. So in a way, it forms a very interesting sort of mix of different stakeholders and governing bodies informing the way which the museums are operated and the collections are managed. Just to go deeper into the structure of the National Collection. So when the artworks in the National Collection are not on display, they're holistically and centrally stored and managed at the National Heritage Board's Heritage Conservation Center, where a team of registrars and photographers and conservators provide the best care possible for the entire National Collection. And for the respective collecting institutions, of course, they would each have their own acquisitions committee, but on top of this level, there's also a National Collections Advisory Panel where the respective institutions also meet with annually to ensure that the larger agenda and the strategies for the building of the national collection are overseen and ensure that there's no conflict of interest between the different agencies that are part of the national collection. And this way of holistic and unified approach towards developing the national collection, I think it's like I said, I think it's very unique to Singapore, a very small state. And sometimes the distance that the curatorial team would have from the collection and its managing entity does provide challenges in accessing our collection easily. However, I think it's also provides an interesting opportunity for curators, as in the case of because the National Collection provides easy access of collections that belong to other museums under the same umbrella of the National Collection, we are able to tap onto the collections of other museums, such as the work you see here on the slide, painting by Sargent, which is in the collection of the National Museum of Singapore, but we can also have very easy access and can feature them and present them in a different, through a different curatorial perspective from the gallery, as opposed to the national museums. What drives our collections development at the gallery is really the research that the curatorial team conducts. And by identifying the key gap areas in our collection, we set the strategy to develop our collection. And what often happens with our research for collections development is that it involves very much integrated with the development of our archives collection, which is directly managed by the gallery. And so the in-depth archival research that curators conduct through their research, both for the artwork collection and the archives, help to develop the collections of both areas. And we, for the library and archives more specifically, we developed the collection primarily through the donation of physical materials, as well as loan for digitization. One of the anchoring offerings centered around our collection at the gallery are the two long-term exhibitions dedicated to art of Singapore and Southeast Asia since the 19th century. So these two galleries are annually rotated to present the latest and the fresh research findings by the curatorial team, with each gallery presenting on average about 400 works. And to present the most compelling narrative in these exhibitions, as well as our changing exhibitions, we often rely and work very closely with our regional stakeholders on loans from the institutions such as those you see here, and many of whom are our MOU partners as well. And it's really it's really with their support and collaboration with these institutions that we are able to sustain our display, and it also opens up, possibilities for joint, areas of research and collaboration as well. On the next slide, I have an overview of the broad, areas of collaboration that we have done with various stakeholders and partners, not only within the region, but also internationally. So our collaboration with partners can take multifaceted forms, ranging from traveling exhibitions that may go both ways, to co-development of curatorial and outreach programs, and also to professional development, such as joint workshops or staff exchange. And one example of such collaboration was co-organizing of a solo exhibition of Malaysian artist Latif Mohidin with Centre Pompidou in 2017. So the exhibition itself actually took place within the project space inside Centre Pompidou's permanent gallery. And this exhibition later then traveled back to the region at Ilham Gallery in Kuala Lumpur. For our large-scale changing exhibitions, we almost never adopt a packaged traveling show, but instead work closely with our partners in exploring ways of connecting and intersecting the topics we're exploring through narratives and artists from the region. So one example was the Century of Light exhibition from 2018, and under the larger theme of Century of Light, there were two exhibitions. So one exhibition on Impressionism that we organized in collaboration with Musée d'Orsay and the Art Gallery of South Australia. But accompanying and complementing this exhibition was a two-man exhibition of the leading artists from Southeast Asia who were active in Europe in the 19th century, namely Valençale and Juan Luna. Seen together as a whole, this exhibition unveiled how the works of pioneer Southeast Asian artists were informed not only by movements in Europe, but how they participated and how the experiences of these leading Southeast Asian artists in Europe have also shaped the art history of this region by drawing on works of these artists in our collection, as well as those that we loaned from multiple institutional and private collections in the region as well. And lastly, an example of professional exchanges was this workshop that we co-organized with Museum of Fine Arts in Vietnam in 2019, where representatives from museums across Vietnam and the gallery staff engaged in days of exchange and conversation around some of the key challenges facing museum management and operation today. Such collaborative projects with overseas institutions have been quite difficult to continue, of course, under the ongoing pandemic. But keeping in mind that the colonial origins of museums in the region, such regional collaboration and co-working is very critical for us as we work toward reclaiming and rewriting the art histories from a post-colonial perspective and imagining the world from and through and with this region. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'd now like to call upon the three speakers. There are about two questions that I'm going to cram together into one, and you will each have 2-3 minutes each, if possible, because that will help us to keep to the timetable. Devika Singh, first.
You have mentioned that there are 8 acquisition committees by regions. And so how many private donors would you invite? And I understand you purchased about 500 new works. So what sort of support do these people provide for the purchase of the collection? And I think you've been looking at how to expand your collection in a global manner. As a national museum or a national collection, to make this collection a global one, does that mean that you are looking into the history from the ages or the times of the British Empire? But is there any difficulty in looking into those past in putting together your collection? Would you be able to answer these questions? Do you have any obstacles or hesitations to tackle history of the British Empire in creating your collection?
Thank you very much for these great questions, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'll answer, I'll begin with your first question on the acquisition committees. Something to keep in mind is that The committees I mentioned are relatively young. The first one was created only in 2008. The first one was our North American Acquisition Committee, and a number of them ensued. The one I work closely with, the South Asia Acquisitions Committee, was created only in 2012, so 10 years ago, of course. What's astounding is the number of artworks that Tate has been able to bring in thanks to these committees, and really how these have helped expand and map in a way an even stronger trajectory from the national to the international, very broadly speaking, which is also what I was trying to map out in my earlier presentation. To answer more precisely some of the questions you had, the committees are constituted, their sizes range, each has several dozens of supporters, and their history is slightly different. Some have a longer history, but also simply because the regions they pertain to may be smaller or larger, whether it's Asia Pacific or South Asia. But most importantly, something to keep in mind is that beyond the funding and beyond that absolutely essential tool that funders, supporters enable us to have, it's also for us, and this is something that's perhaps less visible, that's obvious from the outside, to have other actors and interlocutors in the regions. A lot of the collectors who constitute these committees are based in the regions and in the different countries that we engage with. So that when I was telling you about the constitution of our team, we of course travel research in the field in addition to having colleagues who are adjunct curators based in the regions. We work with artists, we work of course with other museum professionals and collaborate with them, as you know well, and also have other collectors, supporters that we engage with who are based there. And that's something that is also extraordinarily important and goes well beyond matters of funding. Moving now to your second question, a different one, of course, pertaining to how an institution based in Britain engages with the colonial past. And you were asking me also if there was a reluctance to do that. I will speak to my own experience, and I can say absolutely not at the current moment. There is quite the contrary, a strong desire and expectations from our audiences that we do so. And this is the case not only at Tate, but also, I think, in all institutions in the UK, as it ought to be. And what we have as a challenge, if you will, like a lot of institutions, is a desire, a need to act quickly, to respond to these expectations, but to do so in a way that is research-led, that is intellectually rigorous. And sometimes this poses a number of questions, and there are different ways, of course, to address these and to do that. So the other thing to me that is very important to keep in mind, and that is why also I was mentioning from Alexandria to Tokyo, the annual conference that the Hyundai Tate Research Center collaborated with the Mori Art Museum with Sophia University, is that while we address and absolutely need to address British colonial past, which is so much there in not only our collections, but histories and so forth, we also can be too absorbed by our own histories, which is something that could be a risk here. And collaborating with other institutions, collaborating with institutions that are based in countries where experiences of colonialism, of dominations may be articulated differently is something so important. Listening also to artists, to the artists who we bring in, who have a slightly different history than the ones that may have been part of the collection historically, so whose artwork to Britain or the British Empire is something also extraordinarily important, so that we don't map out and project our own experiences when we also deal with such experiences. And this was something I also wanted to add. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。では引き続きジャスパー・シャープさん
Thank you. My next question is to Jasper.
2つ伺いますが、2分ぐらいでまとめてお答えください。
2 minutes for your answer, if possible. Sorry. The first question is pretty simple. You started Phileas in 2014, I understand. How many supporters were there? And how did it all begin? The second question is, I understand that you co-fund your activities with the Ministry of Culture. Could you give us something more about the system? How you actually work together and collaborate with the ministry. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mami, also for the invitation. This is a wonderful initiative. Phileas began with a core of around 15 funders. They were actually a group of people that I had put together in 2013 to support the Austrian Pavilion in Venice at the Biennale. I was the commissioner of the pavilion then. And we assembled a group of people who were fascinated by the idea of supporting production. We donated an edition of the work then. We've grown to around 50 supporters in total now. We have partners and junior partners, some younger people involved. They're a combination of philanthropists, collectors. What they all have in common is a desire to do something, to change something. They're very open-minded. We've built the group quite slowly so that we have communicative, collaborative people in the group. We decide on the funding together. We accompany the production. We travel together. So we would like people that enjoy spending time with. It's not about raising as much money as possible. It's about raising the right kind of money as well. And to your second question, we have a good working relationship with the Ministry of Culture here in Austria. We co-fund almost all of our projects with them. We normally decide on the amount first because our deadline tends to be a little earlier. And then they match it basically 50-50, which helps artists enormously and also carries a little bit more weight in the funding process. We're also talking to them very intensively at the moment about trying to be a little more strategic in terms of putting together with some of the activities that our government do, residency programs overseas, funding galleries to go to art fairs, all sorts of different things with what Phileas is doing, and somehow put them together in a way that joins the dots and maybe puts the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle together in a more fruitful manner. That's an ongoing conversation that we're having.
Thank you. So the final question is to Horikawa-san.
My first question, when creating the National Gallery here in Singapore, I understand 70% of the works are Singaporean and the remaining works come from Southeast Asia. And I think you might have other works from other regions as well. So how did you decide to focus on Singapore and Southeast Asia? Was that a very natural decision to focus on these areas? And the second question is, I'd like to ask about the Visual Arts Cluster and Heritage Board. Which organization do you belong to, and what are the difference between the two? And so it seems that the SAM as well as the National Gallery belong to both of these organizations, the Visual Arts Cluster and Heritage Board. So what's the difference?
Thank you so much, Kataoka-san, for your question. With regards to your first question, I would say it was quite a natural extension and progression from first of all, how the national collection, the visual arts collection within Singapore's national collection had originated. So as I mentioned, the seed donation that was given to the state in 1960 already included works from Southeast Asia, and in the subsequent decades, the focus on Singapore and Southeast Asia sort of never unwavered in the collecting focus of South Singaporean institutions. And I think it has a lot to do with the city-state history and the positioning of Singapore within the region. And of course, for us, our curatorial focus was such that we really wanted to extend and deepen the narrative and rewriting of Southeast Asian modern and contemporary art. So it really came in hand with our curatorial focus, and how, based on the collection history, it was a natural extension of our curatorial work, I would say. And for your second question about VAC, I understand the Singapore structure can be quite complex to understand. I work for National Gallery Singapore, and National Gallery Singapore is part of the visual arts cluster. But just to clarify that each institution within VAC has its own board, CEO and director, and it has manages its operation independently. But having this umbrella structure of visual arts cluster help us identify areas of possible collaboration or joint management, such as human resources or facility management. So where such synergy can be identified, VAC serve as a platform, an umbrella platform to encourage cross collaboration.
ありがとうございました。まだまだ質問したいところなんですが、3人スタンバイ。
I would very much like to ask you more questions, but unfortunately we are out of time. Thank you very much for joining us here today, but we'll have to end this session. Thank you very much, the three of you, for taking part in this symposium. Thank you, David, Jasper, and Horikawa-san. Thank you and goodbye. So we'd like to extend our gratitude to those of you who joined us for session 2. And now we will go on to the next session, which will be our discussion session. I'd like to invite the members of the panel to approach us on stage. And so let me then introduce to you the members on the panel. We have from the Shiga Museum of Art, Mr. Osaka Kanjiro, a representative of the Creative Fund, Koike Ai, Director of Arts Initiative Tokyo AIT, Ms. Shiomi Yoko, a contemporary artist, Tsubaki Noboru, and Chief Curator of the National Museum of Art in Osaka, and Vice Chair of Contemporary Art Committee Japan, Uematsu Yuka. And Kataoka Mami will act and continue as a moderator. I'm sorry, we will now go on with the session without any breaks.
And all of you are active in the field of Japanese contemporary art. And I was wondering if I could ask you to give your initial responses after 3 presentations for the Communication Center, for example, or something that you might have been surprising or astonishing. Starting from Mr. Osaka, please. Thank you. My name is Osaka, Director of the Shiga Museum of Art. Until about a year ago, I've been working for 20 years at a national art museum. So I was looking back over my past experience while listening to the presentations and looking at Singapore. I've been to see the conservation center, which I really thought was outstanding. The idea of having a conservation center which was held jointly, which meant everything could become very compact and also very systematically organized, which was very impressive. It's not just for a country. When I went to Rasovan, and also I think it's something that can be done by different places. Tate has a very interesting basic philosophy and principles, also about Tate Modern, about the national collection, the future of that, was all very illuminating. When I was at the National Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo, I was there at the collection. I was working in collections and acquisitions at one point, and our perspective tended to think only about the specific museum collection, about filling in the gaps. But just having that perspective means that leaving the Tate aside for a moment, looking at all the other Asian institutions, I think that we're not going to be able to compete on the same level if that perspective is the only one that we have. I think that the curators and also the administrative staff tend to think of themselves in terms of the actual individual institution they're belonging to, which I think has to start changing. It's time for that to change. We also are at a point in time where we need to think about synergies. Of course, there are pros and cons in any setup, but I think it's time to begin discussion. And the national collection is extraordinary. When you go to the prefectural level, you become very much aware of that. Even with the Mori Art Museum, I would assume that the national collection is something that Mami has always continued to advise people to go to the Tokyo Museum of Modern Art collection to see it, and that I think is something to be aware of. Koike-san next. Thank you. The talks were all absolute eye-openers, which I hope to be able to learn from. I think that the acquisition committee and the 8 committees at the Tate was very interesting, and I do feel that we'd like to have something like that in Japan. I'm not an art professional. It's just that I happen to have a lot of collectors who tend to be very active collectors who I encounter quite frequently. And in Japan, we don't really have a precise methodology about how to begin as a collector or how to collect. People just tend to collect what they think they like. But I think that listening to the presentation about the Tate is something that could be very instructive for collectors, not just for institutions. About the supporters for the committees, in the case of Tate, there's a global perspective in their collection, but in Japan, we could perhaps have regional committees to have key individuals in each of the parts of Japan or companies, and all those people linked together to raise awareness or raise the profile of local artists. Or perhaps we could have local communities become participants in the committees to start collecting foreign artists. Perhaps collectors and art professionals would be able to work together if they could build these committees together, and they could collaborate in collecting and bringing work to Japan. Would be something lovely to see, I think. Next, we'd like to call upon Shiomi-san. And my name is Shiomi Yoko. I think Hyundai was extremely interesting, Hyundai Research Center, because the research center that we're talking about is also going to be very important as a research center, I think. And the fact that Hyundai is there means that there's the corporate participation, which I think was also very interesting. And Kataoka-san asked us to share our own background. Right now, I'm working with Artscope with Mercedes-Benz, where artists are sent to Berlin. There's an artist in residency program, and previously we had exhibitions at Hara, but there was the Koizumi Meiro work, which was shown for the first time in 2019. And the reason why Koizumi was able to create that work is because the first time he went to Berlin on the residency program, he walked around and thought that the entire city was like a museum which crystallized post-war German history. And he felt that he could really feel the history through the cityscape, which increased his interest in Japanese history, which led to that work. And listening to that, I felt that linking together, creating this virtuous circulation, getting that cycle going is something that could be very interesting to see. Tsubaki-san, as an artist, as an educator, you're very active? Not so much active, but In 1989, I was part of Against Nature, which toured the United States. La Jolla, in 91, I was able to do a solo show. And then it was a private museum, so the museum director was really involved in fundraising. And if you go to a very rich person's house, it was like a palace. And there'd be mayonnaise, and then the ashtray was made by Giacometti. And that's when I realized what the art world was. I think I saw everything. So I've seen the galaxy. It could be tiny, but almost like fractals. And I thought I would like to do something like that, a miniature galaxy in Kyoto, which is what I started doing and which I continue to do up to now. In Japan, everything is drastically different. I've been working as a teacher at an art university. And despite the fact that we have a shrinking youth population, there's been a dramatic increase in the percentage of students in all disciplines except for the arts. When I was a student, it was like 46 people vying against each other for one place, but now it's only about 5 or 6 students competing against each other. So creating a new platform, that kind of thing has really been dissolving and becoming degenerate in Japan. And I wanted to try to restore the damage. And the crucial reason for that is the fact that you can't make ends meet and you can't earn a living. And the parents would say, you can go to study design, but not fine art. Because high school students and their parents will sit on them and tell them, just painting will not allow you to make a living. And overall, people are surrounded by people who keep on trying to convince them it's a bad idea to go to art school. So creating a system so people can paint and make a living and continue to eat properly. That's something which has been very subtle and modest in peripheral, but people have changed their awareness and their evaluation. So listening to the presentation, the center, and also about the communication center, I don't think the galaxy has changed. Things that you should have done have been done, and we haven't been able to do that. The platform is like an operating system for a computer which needs to be updated. But universities and art schools don't do updates. So I'm not supposed to say that out loud in public. Because updates require changes in the teaching staff and also the way in which they educate, but it doesn't happen, so we need to think about how to change, and that's something that we need to think about for the entire country. The operating system needs to be updated constantly, and we need to have a structure, I think. It's really going to be crucial that this center will be able to maintain this circle of really boosting new change and creating new versions and updates for itself. I think that's a crucial element.
And finally, I'd like to call upon Ms. Uematsu, and I know that you work for a museum and you have been also working on the art platform business. What was your view? Thank you very much. I have heard the presentation from the 3 members, and there's something that I want to say. But Mr. Tsubaki just mentioned that there's need for updates. And I think that can be applied to museums as well. Because those of you who are watching this in her live stream, you may not agree with me. But I think going back to 1950, at the time of the museum's opening, and I think there have been some changes made in some of these national museums. I know that there have been changes, and the changes have come through over the ages. But when we see the creation of this communication center, and what is it that we can offer or contribute to the creation or the operation of that center. I think we're all very interested in the research arm of the Tate Museum, and I know that you have a large organizational power. You also have a much larger fund than what we are used to, and you then have that additional research center, which probably offers that very abundant funds at Tate, where you'll be able to then enrich the human resources power. And we have to then try to identify what it is that we have to do in order to make or go through these steps of updating. I think this might be the best timing for going through the updates. It's been 70 years since national museums have been established, and we have seen that there are certain things which need to be all concentrated at one organization, which will be umbrella over this many national museums. And what is it or what are some of the specific things that need to be done as a part of these endeavors for organizing these national museums? Do you have any wish list of what you would be able to, you like to be able to do, and how would you be then interacting with, let's say, prefectural museums or some municipal museums? When we look at the purchasing funds, it is true that national museums do have much more abundant funds as compared to other types of museums, and there are some special budget being allocated to the national museums, and I hope that good uses are made of this. Now, I have curated various architectural exhibits myself, and looking at how these exhibits should be organized when they are done by national museums, and then how should these exhibits then be made into traveling exhibits. These are things that we need to look at, and I hope that we'll be able to have a much larger scale of these exhibits. And of course, it's necessary to have some sort of an organization that will overreach all of these efforts.
So, Hosaka-san, you wrote for BT Online, and you mentioned that we don't have registrars or coordinators in Japan, and that was an outstanding issue which needs to be worked upon. For example, in the case of international committees at the Mori Art Museum, it's basically a situation where the registrar is responsible for a great number of activities which are completely out of the scope of a curator's work. So when Tokyo MoMA was taking an exhibition abroad, for example, is it possible for national centers to step in and do support? I think that's a very loaded and guiding question where it's being taken in a specific way. The Japan Foundation I worked with the Japan Foundation on a number of occasions, and I think that's what kind of thing is necessary. With international touring exhibitions, curators tend to say, I'm going more focused on the next exhibition I'm going to be doing. I don't want to do this. So if that's the situation, then it's a very unhappy situation because the curator was no longer interested in that exhibition, and the exhibition, which was something that the national government would like to take abroad, wasn't going to be introduced. Curators tend to want to curate, but just telling them to sit down and say there are people who actually adore doing just management stuff, people who just adore doing communicative stuff. And if you want to hire those people, they might not necessarily have to be curators. So perhaps we need to shape a system where these people can participate in the ecosystem and make it sustainable. Koike-san, any thoughts? You're from the private sector, but thinking about the National Gallery Singapore, which started with an individual making a donation. M+ in Hong Kong has received a tremendous number of donations. But there are systems for private collectors to be involved in museums. Well, in Japan, the vast majority of collectors don't even think it's possible for them to have a connection with museums. It's not a negative thing, it's just that they really don't know about it. It's a lack of information. In Europe and the United States, collectors and curators tend to be very close. There's advice about what to buy, what about the next thing to collect. There are people who get advice from curators or who go to art fairs together. And if there's a major exhibition, they tend to talk about what pieces are still available for sale. And that helps people to sense how they could collect wisely and cleverly. They'd also be able to get some sense of the zeitgeist. It's a very good opportunity, so perhaps we could have a program for that kind of thing. The acquisition committee of the Tate was one example. And perhaps some kind of program could be shared through case studies, which could help curators to become aware of how they could participate. Another thing is that the professionals in the art world are tremendously dedicated, but they really don't talk about money at all. So for somebody from the business field, it seems unreal because they don't have any money, but they simply try to survive on grit and passion and their mental strength. I mean, it's incredible. I can't believe it. Because it's not something which can be done just with business constraints, which is why there's so much history, but perhaps funding could be done, not just depending on government, but at the same time, tax revenue does have its positive elements, so perhaps there could be something could be discussed. I'm also a participant in the subcommittee which discusses economic activity and support. Perhaps there could be something which could be provided as a tax rebate or a tax waiver. So something which is monetarily rewarding as well. If the government could support that, then I think it would be marvelous. Thank you. So Shiomi-san. There are global, bigger issues, and I would guess that Shiomi-san shares those ideas. Well, Art Initiative Tokyo 8 has been active for the past 20 years. We have been surviving, barely. But one of the things that we're interested in is the climate crisis and art. And when I think about the role that can be shouldered by museums, then a sustainable way of being for these art institutions and decarbonization for the art world would be things that I've been thinking about before preparing for this meeting. There are 2 points. One is cutting back on CO2 emissions, so exhibition, preservation, conservation, all those, including promotion and also sending out abroad. All those need to be reassessed from the perspective of sustainability, perhaps sustainability for all of the factors involved in the art cycle is something which is going to be incumbent upon us. Another thing is that renewable energy, switching over to LEDs, utilizing waste, also research trips, not so many plane flights, perhaps 2003, 2004, and 2020, the 3 years or so. I think there's been a 44% decline in overseas travel. it might not be appropriate because of the pandemic impact, but I think the Tate is really a predecessor, is very much at the foreguard in terms of the climate crisis as well. So things that the museum world have been taking for granted need to be reassessed and re-understood from the perspective of sustainability. Also, that position, that role of thinking about that from a holistic way, that kind of brain or perspective is necessary. SIMAM is also thinking about that, I think, with general principles which should be adopted and applied internationally, which I think is going to be very important. That's one thing. The second point is, when it happens, artists, art, and museums, their roles will probably begin to change as well. And when thinking about exhibitions or education and outreach, the climate crisis, the destruction of ecosystems, the haves and have-nots, all those important issues are going to be things where the museums can perhaps provide places and spaces for them to be considered or discussed. But if you just focus on those, the climate crisis makes you feel very despondent about the future. There is so much which is very difficult, and you tend to become very depressed. It might actually deprive your will to be active and to be lively. So another point about museums, about the care, about providing healing, providing shelter, or acting as a shelter rather, and also to provide a respite from inequality. Thank you.
So I think these are very urgent issues that we are facing, and I know the contemporary art is also facing these environmental issues. We're talking about climate change, how to handle that, and I don't think we are really into that yet as an art world. But if the state does create some sort of a cultural policy here that will take that into consideration, that can be promoted in the outlying regions as well. And Mr. Tsubaki, I'm wondering what you think is what the state can do. And I know that you have a smaller organization where you're able to be very agile in your activities. But what is it that you ask the government or the state to do? And I know we often discuss agility, agile, and so it's really a matter of how you're able to adapt to changes. How are you able to make your changes yourselves? I don't know whether changes equal evolution, but I think it's okay that you can make changes. You can say something in the morning, and you can change your mind in the evening, and how you can do that. The government offices can also do that. So I think the state needs to be more agile and not be held down with this gravity. And as Koike-san mentioned, we need to be able to convince the people of the private sector. Now, she said that some of the subject raised today were quite new and unusual for her. And I thought that I had been asked to make a recommendation to Mr. Kono about art, and then I was engaged to convince people from the entrepreneurs. Now there are people in the business sector, and then I understand that they were trying to use me as fundraisers. And I was told, well, you had all the advantages won, and it is because I was able to find. I had friends in the business circles, and that allowed me to raise funds very easily. And I know that artists' fairs or art fairs are very much tied to these private sector businesses, and then we have established ties to the business sector as well. And artists can also act in that intermediary position, but we have to also be in the teaching position. I have to also be in the curation position. But we need to break down these walls. And I guess we can say that at La Jolla, I had been able to work as a fundraiser. And when we looked at a group of the board members, I had to give some thought to the table setting or positioning each people at the table, who I should place next to which person, so that we can encourage them to be more active. And for example, there was a case when I went to an event, then everyone was very well dressed and all perfumed. Whereas if you go to a public institution in Japan, and if you meet with the curators, they are never dressed very fancily. And I think these people also need to go out and then start talking to the business sectors as well, because they are able to show their understanding. They are able to offer you support. I think it's just the problem of some of these public sector people having reluctance to approach the business sector to reap any contributions or reap benefits from them. And Uematsu-san, you are also engaged in the preparation of the Art Communication Center establishment. There are things that we can do, there are things that we cannot do, but what is it that you are looking to in the establishment of this institution? In the art platform business that Kataoka-san is also engaged in, we have understood that the new communication center will take on the work of putting together an archive or information center. So I'm wondering whether or what the communication center can adopt or take on from the other organizations. And it's not possible for the art communication center to take on all of the responsibilities and all of the roles. So we need to be careful in choosing what it is that we will be asking the art communication center to take on. And I think I've been able to recover some time, and I think we are going to be able to spend about 10 minutes to answer any questions from the floor or from the audience from our streaming. So please submit your questions if you have any. So far, we have not received any questions through the streaming.
If there don't seem to be any questions, perhaps we can continue. The Tokyo Tate Research Center Transnational seems to be a very interesting concept, because when you think about a national government event, you tend to have to think about the weight of something which is national around your shoulders. When you think about, it's important to think about your own country's cultural policy, at the same time transcending those national borders, and how different regions, different individuals, different museums can come together, how they can collaborate, and how they can look at creating transnational values is going to be very important for the future, I think. But thinking about the future, looking at Asia, the tremendous number of friends and colleagues, what are your thoughts? Hosaka-san first, please. Sun Shower was at here, and also at Mori. And then after that, there was an Asian art exhibition at the Tokyo Museum of Modern Art. So the Japanese government has been looking at Asian art, but there hasn't been a basic policy for that. And Tokyo Museum of Modern Art was rather taken aback by the fact that National Arts Center and Mori were working together on an exhibition before our museum. But it's not something where the government or the National Museum was able to say that we were working on this project first, or we were already working on this project. Perhaps it's the awareness, the mindset, or how people send out the message. Koike-san? In Japan, looking at all the other genres or all the different segments of art, I think that old ancient art is really strong because there's so much which is outstanding technically, and there is so much which can be very vibrant just in Japan. And when you have a discussion limited just to Japan, but completely ignoring the world makes it impossible to create momentum. You need to have an international context if you're going to be introducing Japanese artists to foreign audiences. So contemporary art is something which is really appropriate for international exhibitions or programs. It's something which a lot of people are not aware of. I know that your mindset and your perspective is completely different because you're professionals, but perhaps we could share those aspects of insights with the general public. Thank you. Transnational collaboration or trans something and cutting across the different divisions. I think it was Jasper who was speaking about collaborative processes. They find out what is lacking and then propose what should be done, which I think is also going to be necessary for the National Center. Looking at what is lacking in national policy and thinking about how they can work on the basic processes. Also, collaboration is something that artists have been doing under their own initiative, working together with Asia and also Europe. So getting their insights is also very important, I think. So, Tsubaki-san next. I went to 3331 Arts Tutor as a member of the committee or board of directors ever since it was established. But the local politicians don't know about that. There's an outstanding case study and success. There's a tremendous network through the Arts in Residence program, and they are economically viable. They have 20 people on their payroll. But even despite that, government, local and national, don't really know about that. They don't really recognize that, which I think is a key problem. The artists are moving under their own volition, and overseas artists in residence programs. Young people are sent to Qatar. People come from Qatar. There's this tremendous interaction. And we need to be able to have those positive momentums recognized and developed further. And what's crucial is to have government and corporations and artists and educational institutions working together. So bringing down the boundaries. You know, one of the worst things about the pandemic is that you can't go out and get drunk together. Because usually if you go out and you get drunk together, then you are able to create a starting point for anything. I think that's the same with any artist in any country around the world. So what's interesting, what's fun, what's intriguing, I hope people will catch up with us. And what Kyoto Prefecture has been working, the way in which they've been working is really because of the ability of local governments to get donations from people who live in other locations as a special sort of tax credit combined with a gift, and also support for different communities around Japan. So perhaps we could have more people like us, like what we've been doing, to link people together, people losing prejudice, because there's so much prejudice against contemporary art, because high school teachers in Japan tell their pupils that nobody should ever go to practice contemporary art. So the artists and the curators need to really transform themselves, transcend the boundaries and the borders. And you need to really break out of your comfort zone to say that you can take on different roles, you can cover different positions, you can watch your teams back, because otherwise the system itself is so defunct in many ways that we need to have the ability to simply give a helping hand to the person who's standing next to you, to shoulder responsibilities and step in, which I think is going to help with the OS updating.
Thank you. And Uema-san, last word. We talked about the transnational organization of her Tate, as Ms. Kataoka mentioned. The plan came out after her seeing what MoMA had been doing. They have the international council members, they had regional council members, which then expanded. And so her going beyond each regional scope, they found that there had members who would take part in her purchasing of artworks. And I think that was what Tate had also caught on. And Osaka-san talked about sun shower or awakening exhibit, which Osaka-san mentioned. We have seen her collaboration between Japanese museums and also the foreign museums. And there is the Japan Foundation, which is an organization that can play a role in that. And I think that might have been one of the diplomatic strategies of Japan. But they had played important role in having such exchange between the art institutions here and abroad. And so if the communication center needs to disseminate information to the outside world, we have to see what the cultural agency can do in supporting that. Now, I don't know how far back this was, maybe 2 years ago. Horikawa-san talked about her gallery here in Singapore. And there's the SAM, the Singapore Art Museum, which is also working in her collaboration to work with a museum in Hong Kong. So they had that sort of collaborated work. And the two museums had people, registrars, conservators, and so they also had marketing people. And the fact that they were able to also disseminate that information as to what they had done in collaborating over these projects. And we want to see how the communication center can take on some of these roles that I have just mentioned. And I know that we've just come to the end of our session, but we do have a question that has been submitted. At the Art Communication Center, who is it for? who is the target for the use of the Art Communication Center was the question. I don't know if I can answer this properly, but it's really for experts in the in museums here, but it's also about the general public as well, because we're talking about working with the society as a whole, and we also are going to be talking to the general public as well. And because we are going to be disseminating information abroad, that will also include the overseas museum institution as well as the general public out abroad. And so I think that's what Uematsu-san had tried to mention. But currently we are looking at targeting everyone around us. But what we need to do is to target areas that we are lacking in, or where we are seeing some gaps. And Jasper mentioned putting together a jigsaw puzzle. I think we would want to be able to fill in the gaps that we are seeing. We also want to see what we could do for education. And can you give us some words of hope for those students who are engaged in study of art? And maybe Tsubaki-san, you would like to comment on that?
They have deep roots. That's all I can say. We'll work on them one by one. But our university has been successful. A lot of people come from Tokyo to go to graduate school at our university. And when I talk to them and ask them why they moved over to our university, they say, because I want to succeed. And he's already sold 10 million yen's worth of his work. So it links together with economic viability, and he can work together with museums and also art galleries, so he can get value added. But I can't give you more details than that. Don't lose hope. Last question is, the Art Communication Center linking together with regional museums would make it possible for... Will it make it possible for local museums collections to be shared and to be with national and also international audiences? I'm not in a position to speak on behalf of the center, but collection, that database, is the core to understand and to make possible to visualize and to make visible what collections hold what pieces. So how to use them, how they can be taken abroad. That kind of large circle is something that we hope to be able to achieve as well. So we hope to be able to create a future where that's going to be doable and possible. There are questions that we could not respond to, but we will be getting back to those people who shared their questions with us. And it was a very condensed and also intense session, but I think we had some very interesting discussions. Thank you very much indeed.
I'd like to thank the panel members for joining us here for the symposium. This brings us to the end of our session. We had two interpreters, Yoko Takayoko and Kobayashi Akiko, as interpreters. And the filming was done by Aoyama Shinya and his team. And in the operation of this symposium, I'd like to thank all of those who had contributed their capacities and capabilities for the success of the symposium. With this, we'd now like to come to the close of our symposium today. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us here for this Art Platform Japan Symposium. Thank you for your participation.